The weather has sort of got my asthma all over the place. So if you hear me harken, I'll just put myself on mute and then continue when I'm done. But the purpose of this training is really to talk about the the next step in our work in our education justice project. Again, it's primarily funded by the Meyer Foundation, but the purpose of this project was to provide outreach, training, and advocacy to DC families um, around some of the rules and regulations that have come out as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the things that we wanted to know as a result, really, of this project is what disparities in education and who did they impact when we think about COVID-19. So we conducted an impact assessment, both in English and Spanish, of district families to identify those who have been impacted by those policies and practices. And we recently wrapped up focus groups where we talk with families more about how this is impacting them. And this is sort of the next step, which is the training. So before we get started into the meat of this, let's have a 5-minute discussion about what your child needs in order to be successful academically right now. And then we want to answer, how about non-academically? So I want to give you time to think about that. And then if you could just drop your responses either in the chat, or you guys could take yourselves off mute when ready to have that discussion.
And because I'm one of the parents who got to preview this, I will, while you guys are thinking, tell you a little bit about what I've realized that my kids needed as we went through this process. But I'm going to give you exactly one time to teacher a minute of quiet thinking before we do that. A real minute is longer than people realize, isn't it? So I will start us off. And again, we don't have to spend a whole lot of time here if you don't want to, but again, please feel free to drop it in the chat. One thing that I was really surprised at how much my kids needed was social interaction and structured support for that social interaction. And they weren't really able to do academics at one point during the pandemic because they didn't have that structured interaction with other people. And it was really unmooring to them, and they were very discombobulated. And as we've come back into education and into, a more structured educational setting, one thing that I've learned that my kids need that I didn't know that they would need is kind of that time in community. It's almost like they have a deficit of social time that they're rebuilding right now. So I've been surprised at how much social energy and social time that they need right now, and that connects to both their academic and their non-academic existence. Are there other things that people have seen or realized that they've really been thinking about or have surprised them maybe? Oh, I like this, the highlight of the word community. Yes. Yes, time away from you, because I think they've become, too attached. And like some parents have really reported a lot of like lapsing in functional skills, like independent living skills are not where they used to be, or independent study skills aren't where they used to be. Consistency. That's a real thread that we hear. Predictability, consistency. Okay, we're going to stay on this for just another couple moments. spelling, reading books instead of screens. I know some kids have not looked at a book in a long time. Okay. So this conversation today is informed by the things that you're thinking about right now, but it's not exclusively about the things that you're thinking about right now. And I want to frame that very clearly for folks. You know, families and students have a lot of rights in the education space. Shockingly, kids with disabilities actually have more rights than their non-disabled peers. I want folks to remember and think about education being a civil and human rights, a civil and human right of children, but I also am not going to read through this whole list of family rights. Okay. But I think the framing that I want people to keep in mind is that kids had a right to an appropriate education during the pandemic. That's the bottom line. Okay, kids had a right to an education that was appropriate for their needs during the pandemic, and many of them didn't get it. Okay, and that's really what's informing today's conversation. There are a million other rights that kids have and a million other rights that families have that we're not going to go over. That includes, the right to view records, the right to notice, the right to disagree, the right to resolution. We're not going to talk about all that today. But I want you to have that rights framework in mind and remember that your child had a right to an education during the pandemic, throughout the whole pandemic, regardless of their disability. Okay? All right. Oh, I love this comment. Kids are very overstimulated in the classroom after being able to control their environment for over a year. I see this so much. Yes, absolutely. I see this at work where I'm like, why are people talking to me at work? I've had a whole year where all I had to deal with was my cat and my dog, and that's it. So Jasmine, go ahead and jump in and tell us a little bit about what COVID did and didn't do, which most of these folks I think know, but we're gonna plow forward.
So I think, as you all know, COVID-19 definitely changed the learning environment and the services provided, whether intended or unintended. Some of those key changes made to the learning environment includes how attendance is being tracked. For some schools, we've definitely heard from families that if a child turns off their camera for too long, that's being counted as an absence, for example. Changes in how IEP and related services are provided. We understand that there was a lot of reliance on families during this time to be able to get kids, especially their related services and what that looks like. And then changes in how assessments were provided. A lot of that was provided in a virtual environment, which may work for some kids, may totally not work for other kids. So those are just a few of the changes that happened during COVID-19. But one thing we wanted to highlight for you, and I think Maria said something about this early on, which is, a lot of this information is already out there. We are just providing it in the framework of where do we go from here, and really in a way that helps families be able to access this information. And so this information is coming from OSSE's guidance, OSEP guidance, which is the Office of Special Education Programs, our federal U.S. Department of Education, and it's also coming from READ and the Andrew F. standards.
Okay. So as you've heard me say, and I'm going to say again and again tonight, LEAs had the obligation. LEA, by the way, is Local Educational Agency. It's not my pet name for school districts. LEA, Local Educational Agency. They had the obligation to provide kids with a FAPE during the pandemic. And the nature of that FAPE didn't change. And I think this is so important for folks to hear and remember, okay? Schools didn't have an obligation to provide FAPE Lite. They didn't have an obligation to provide, some miniature version of FAPE. Their standard didn't change. So during the pandemic, they still had to meet the Andrew F. standard, okay? And the Andrew F. standard is just kind of a fleshed out version of the free appropriate public education we've all talked about. I'm trying to convince folks that we should no longer say FAPE, that we should say FAPE or something and have two A's in there instead of talking about FAAP. Yeah, talk about FAAP instead of just FAPE. Because Andrew F. Highlighted the fact that the education that a child is entitled to has to be appropriately ambitious. Okay. So take a second, and I really want you to absorb this. To meet its obligation under IDEA, right, special education law, schools must offer an IEP that is reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress
Stop. I don't want that.
in light of the child's circumstances, appropriate progress in light of the child's circumstances, and the demands on the child must be more than minimal. Okay, more than minimal. It's got to be appropriately ambitious, and every child should have the chance to meet challenging learning objectives, whatever that challenge is for them. Okay, this standard did not change during the pandemic. Okay, and I know a lot of people are feeling like, well, my kid definitely didn't do anything appropriately ambitious last year. We were just kind of treading water all year. Okay, so I just want you to keep that in mind. Appropriately ambitious, okay, more than minimal. Okay, Andrew F. really made that FAPE standard clear, made it clear that it was more robust. Okay, and also during the pandemic, during virtual learning, during blended learning, during this time, LEAs should have continued to provide special education and related services identified in the IEP and any needed modifications or alterations to make the curriculum and services more accessible. So, I mean, the way I explain it to both school districts and families is that the law didn't change. Okay, just because we all went home, the law didn't change. Okay, and students still needed what they needed. Okay, that individualization should have been there, and that then those accommodations and modifications should have been there, and they maybe needed to be different because the child was learning at home. Okay, teams needed to consider distance learning plans in the case of a change or a need to go back and forth between virtual and in person, which I think we're all seeing right now. And we'll have another conversation another day about creating those virtual learning plans. But I think a lot of us are now seeing that maybe this return to school is temporary or perhaps a little more intermittent than we thought it was. Okay. But the framing I want you guys to have as we think about this and think about this conversation is that both the state and the federal government has been very, very clear. The law is the law, hasn't changed. FAPE, the obligation to provide a free, appropriate public education hasn't changed. Okay, sound good? It's very exciting when a lawyer gets to say nothing has changed. This is my whole crux of my training, right? Nothing has changed. The law stayed the same even though there was a pandemic. All right. The other thing that didn't change is that parents are still a valued part of the IEP team and valued partners in this process. So parents should know what's going on and should receive regular communication. Okay. And a parent or a student's refusal or inability to participate during school closure didn't mean the school no longer had an obligation to provide that FAPE. Okay. If the student was unavailable because of illness, because of internet shortages, because the student just wasn't psychologically or emotionally available, or perhaps the student wasn't able to access online instruction because of their disability, that didn't change the law either. Okay, just like a student at school who is struggling to access the instruction provided because of a disability still has a right to FAPE. A student who is at home is still entitled to a FAPE. Okay. And then the other thing that I wanted to flag, because this was something that came up a lot during the very beginning of the pandemic, we didn't need to have every single kid in the district didn't need to have an IEP team meeting or an amendment because we were transitioning to remote or blended learning, right? But services that couldn't be provided or weren't provided effectively. Okay, and I want you to keep that in mind. Services that couldn't be provided, but also services that couldn't be provided effectively. You need to have a conversation with the school when you come back about what that looks like and what we're going to do about that. Okay. And I see the note in the chat about LEAs are still obligated even when they're on suspension. So students who are generally speaking, students who have a disability who are removed from the general, wherever their school placement is, in excess of 10 days have a right to their IEP services after those 10 days. generally speaking. It can vary, and there's some tweaks to that, but the bottom line is your right to FAPE doesn't go away. And after, you can have up to a 10-day suspension without services being delivered in that interim. Okay. Does that make sense? Sound good? Okay. And again, I just want to highlight, just because a service wasn't provided or it wasn't provided effectively. Okay. So a service that didn't work, that didn't do what it was supposed to do, that doesn't count. That's not an excuse. Okay. All right. LEAs must provide equal access for educational opportunities. Okay, equal access. What does that mean? It means these IEP team meetings can occur via telephone, video conference, anything that you need to do to encourage parental participation. And IEP revisions that are happening, again, because of the pandemic or for any other reasons, should be based on student need. Okay, this isn't a new thing. IEP revisions should always be based on student need, not the capacity of the school district. Okay, that has been the law before the pandemic. It was the law after the pandemic. It's the law during the pandemic. Okay, it is the needs of the student that drives the train, makes the decisions. It's not the needs of the school district. It's not the capacity of the school district. And I always remind folks that we know that this is a law because law has a special word for it. Okay, we're shoehorning students when we're making IEP decisions based on the ability of the district to implement or the capacity of the district to implement. And we're not going to shoehorn students. Decisions are made based on the needs of the student, not the capacity of the school district. Okay. And then finally, IEPs should, of course, be revised if the student's needs change. One reason why a student's needs might change is if they're out of school for an extended period of time due to illness or medical complications, right? So none of this is new information. I'm just framing it in the context of the COVID crisis, right? Right. So the thing I think a lot of people struggled with at the very beginning of the pandemic is we didn't know how to think about this because we were like, oh my gosh, it's new. Well, guess what? We had the tools to deal with this the whole time. Same language, same law. We're just applying it to this new set of facts. Okay. All right. Oh, Jasmine, you get to talk about the telehealth application services. Okay.
So LEAs should have made an attempt to meet IDEA procedural timelines and reach agreements with parents if those timelines were not able to be reached, right? So that means that a school could not have made an independent decision about how and when to meet procedural timelines if they weren't going to meet them. They had to come to an agreement with parents about any extensions. Those had to be documented through a prior written notice. The prior written notice is important to mention here, but it does not constitute a waiver, but it's just documentation of what happened or what didn't happen and why. If face-to-face evaluations were not possible, data could have been collected through student observations, classroom data, parent or student input, IEP progress reports, and other informal means. So for some students, depending on their disability or availability, being able to provide evaluations virtually may not have worked at all, but there are other ways in which they could have, excuse me, still done some evaluation, even if it were informal. And then for medically fragile students, IEP teams should have made individual decisions to determine what accommodations and modifications were necessary. This includes home instruction.
All right. And again, home instruction was always on the table for medically fragile students. And if their needs change because of the pandemic, that means that we need to talk about home instruction, right? All right. IDEA also includes parent counseling and training. This is so huge. I need to talk about it for a minute. Okay. IDEA, as I think most of you know, because most of you are pretty experienced parent advocates or professionals in the space, IDEA has a lot of related services. Right? We've got speech language, we've got counseling, we have occupational therapy. There's a ton of related services. One related service that has historically been underutilized, but is listed in the same federal regs as all the other related services, is parent training and counseling. Okay? Parent training and counseling. What that is support for the parent to help them implement the IEP, to help them support the family so the family and the student can achieve the student's learning goals. It is different than the parent training that AJE provides. Okay. The parent training that AJE provides is so you know about all the related services like speech language counseling and parent counseling and training. Okay, parent counseling and training is delivered by the school. And some examples of it pre-pandemic would be things like helping the parent understand the child's behavior intervention plan, or helping the parent understand the child's unique disability so they're better able to support the child's learning at home. In the pandemic, we saw a lot of schools saying to families, well, parent, this is the kind of instruction we need you to do, or we need you to help us with this instruction. And parents often didn't know how to do that. For families of students with disabilities, adding parent training and counseling to the IEP is a great way to make sure that the student is still accessing FAPE at home, but also while not shifting the burden of FAPE to parents. Okay, and that's why it's highlighted in blue. Local educational agencies can't shift the FAPE obligation to the parent, even during COVID. This is an obligation that school districts have. School districts got the federal money. They are the ones named local educational agency. They're the ones with the legal obligation to provide the free, appropriate public education. And parent training and counseling isn't an excuse to shift that burden. It's a way to make it so it's better, it's more effective, so there's a meaningful partnership, so there's investment in parents, so parents can help. But the obligation is still on the school district, even during distance learning, even during at-home instruction. Okay. Right. Okay, you're nodding. Thank you. See, I need that. It's very important. All right. So other things that we can use parent training and counseling for, again, is helping the parent support occupational therapy goals, for example. So the parent understands, what the purpose of these goals are and maybe how to support that work at home. Another thing can be helping them understand things like Orton-Gilliam, which is, an intervention and a teaching modality for students who are struggling with reading and may have dyslexia. That's the kind of thing you can get from parent counseling and training. Okay, and again, I always want to be clear, it is not the same thing that AJE provides. AJE provides parent training in the law and the policies and best practices and advocacy, but we don't provide IEP services. And parent training and counseling is an IEP service. Okay. All right. So specialized instruction and related services should be providing and using best practices. Okay. Best practices in this space are, again, pretty straightforward, right? Providing technology ahead of time. This was something that was a best practice before the pandemic, right? Being ready for your sessions, talking to families about when's a good time to meet, when's a time to go do this, identify solutions to anticipated distractions. And families should have had a written schedule of service delivery. I've been really amazed at the number of families who called us and they said, yeah, I had no idea that counseling was supposed to happen Tuesdays at 2. Nobody told me that. So families should be aware of that. And if families aren't aware of that, that is a failure to provide FAPE. You can't use the families, not an excuse to not, the family can't be an excuse for the LEA not to provide FAPE. Okay. Sound good? All right, I promise we're going to get into more nitty-gritty soon. All right, again, homebound instruction, optional distance learning. LEAs must make sure that the continuum of placements are available, including homebound instruction in hospitals and institutions. Again, this is an IEP team decision. It's not unilateral. And anytime, just like pre-pandemic, after a student with a disability has spent more than 10 consecutive school days out of school, the IEP must review the student's placement, period. So if we have a kid who's not going to school right now because of the pandemic, we need to have a conversation. Why is that happening? Is it because of a disability related reason? Is this child able to access FAPE? And we need to have that conversation. If homebound instruction is necessary, the team has to amend the IEP. And homebound instruction can also be delivered via distance learning models. Again, I want to be really clear. Home and hospital instruction and homebound instruction are not the same thing as homeschooling. Homeschooling is something completely different. Okay, homeschooling is where you get a divorce from your local educational agency. Okay, and you become the responsible party for all aspects of your child's education. Okay, sound good? Sound okay with me? All right. So, whew. Jasmine, you want to do this slide?
Sure.
All right.
So this is what we were talking about earlier. If a student does not receive services for more than 10 consecutive school days, and this is the same as a regular school year where kids are in school, we're not sitting at home, no virtual learning, then an IEP team must make an individualized decision to determine whether a student with a disability requires compensatory services. Now, this can happen because of a school closure. This could also happen because one or more of the IEP services couldn't be provided through distance learning, services were delayed, or the student was unavailable because of sickness. This determination should be made when school resumes, which presumably should be happening now. Hopefully you guys are having conversations with your schools, or let me reverse that because we're not going to put that on families. Schools should be having conversations with families about the need for comp ed at this point. IEP teams have broad flexibility for determining what services should be provided based on the student need. This is something I need to highlight here because just like if this were pre-COVID times, there is no set menu for what compensatory services look like and how much a student should get. Those are conversations that has to happen within the IEP team. Accelerated learning, however, is a response to recovery services that focuses on placing unfinished learning in the context of new learning. So did you want to say something, Maria?
Nope, keep going.
Oh, I was going to say, so this is not limited to special education services. It is available for all students, and it's an additional service that could happen throughout the day. Compensatory education is intended to put a child in a position they would have been had the LEA provided the services or provided the services according to the READ standard. So it's not just if a child receives services, but sometimes it's even whether or not a child benefited from the services they were actually provided. Extended school year, which is over at this point, but the difference is here, and this slide really just highlights the difference between all of the terms so you guys understand what the school is talking about. But the extended school year that happens during summer is used to prevent learning loss during school breaks, i.e. summer and winter. Comp ed can be given in addition, or could have been given in addition to ESY, so long as it didn't interfere with ESY services. I don't know that anybody had any conversations with schools because they were not required during at least this past summer to have conversations about comp ed until this school year actually began.
So I want to highlight a couple things about this slide and then chat and respond to some things in the chat. First of all, I want to note that ESY, again, OSSI in the district has been very, very clear. ESY does not have to be just in the summer. Okay, it can be at other breaks during the school year. And compensatory education is different and separate from, the accelerated learning or the targeted tutoring or the recovery planning more generally. Okay, compensatory education is really about IEP goals and progress towards IEP goals, whereas accelerated learning, targeted tutoring, high dose intensity tutoring, all of that's really more focused on general education goals. Now, obviously, because special education and general education are part and parcel and deeply connected, and you can't talk about one without the other. This means that accelerated learning, recovery, COVID recovery, and compensatory education are also deeply connected. The thing I really want folks to remember and think about is that compensatory education is intended to put kids back where they would have been had there been no denial of FAPE. Okay, and that's the READ standard. Okay, so that means if your kiddo didn't make progress towards their IEP goals, you need to have a conversation about why that happened. Okay, that's kind of the bottom line. And the other thing I want you to know is that schools have been told they have to do this. The federal government told them they have to do this. OSSI told them they have to do this. It should not result in an emotional conversation with the school district. Your school should not feel deeply offended or traumatized. that you're talking to them about comp ed, because they have been told that they need to talk about it with everybody. Okay, everybody. Because the reality is that we know that a lot of our kids didn't reach their goals, and their rights, because the law didn't change, their right to that progress didn't go away. Okay, so if you're, so please don't feel any trepidation to have this conversation or to hear this conversation. Does that make sense? Sound good? Okay, I see this note in the chat and I think I want to highlight it because it connects to this. The question is it true that accommodations aren't extended past ELA and math class? And then I see the next thing in the chat, so we'll talk about that too. So accommodations and modifications can be across the whole school day. Okay, for example, if I have a hearing impairment, guess what? I'm going to need that hearing impairment accommodated in English and math class, but I'm also going to need that hearing impairment accommodated at the cafeteria. Okay, I'm going to need it accommodated in gym class. Okay, so a student with a disability has a disability all day long, and all aspects, they have access to the whole school experience. So that means accommodations and modifications as they need to access things that are, not English and math, they still need them. Okay, so hopefully that answers your question, or at least gives you the framing to think about your question. So this is another second great question. So is comp ed something that the school provides in school or outside of school? This is a great question. So compensatory education and connected to that are missed services, making up of missed services. This is something that traditionally happens outside of school. Traditionally, this happens outside of school, outside of the regular school day. Now you can, if you have a student who's unable to tolerate additional services outside of school, think about one, what services they could tolerate and what might be appropriate. Or you could think about changes to the IEP to that were compensatory in nature. I generally, honestly recommend that people try to think creatively about compensatory education. In part because 8 hours of school in the regular school day is a long day for most of our kiddos. For our kiddos with a disability, it's particularly hard. So when we're looking at compensatory education, what's going to put that child in a place that they would have been had they gotten everything they were supposed to get in the way they were supposed to get it and achieve the goals they were supposed to get might not actually be more school. Okay, so I always encourage folks to think creatively about comp ed, because it is something that's supposed to be provided outside of school, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in the form of just more school. Okay. Makes sense?
And Maria,
Yes, ma'am.
sorry to interrupt you, but Kristen had a question.
Okay.
Which is around suspension, and basically if they refuse to allow the child to be in school physically, but maybe had them participating virtually, is that allowed?
So I'm always reluctant to answer questions like that specifically, but we can talk a little bit more about that offline. But generally speaking, our kids with disabilities should have the full access to everything that our kids without disabilities have. Okay, generally speaking, that's the rule. So no, generally speaking, if everybody's back in school, all of our kids with disabilities should be back in school. But I think there's a worthwhile conversation to be had around what that looks like and what it might need to be. But generally speaking, if our kids are, we don't, part of me wants to say, absolutely, of course not, your child needs to be back in school tomorrow. But there's probably way more facts to that conversation that I don't want to make you have that conversation in front of 100 people while it's being recorded. So we can talk more about that. Does that make sense? All right. Okay. And yes, it could be internships. Absolutely. Comp ed could be internships. Comp ed could be a lot of different things. So just keep that in mind and be creative. What's going to work for your student. Okay. So this is what I just said a minute ago. IEP teams will be required to consider whether compensatory education for students with IEPs is needed once they return to school. It can be revisited and it can be an iterative conversation, which means we have it a couple of times. Okay. But they've been required to do it. Okay. The feds told them they need to think about comp ed. And it can be revisited. So it's like, look, it could be that, hey, look, you know what? My family right now at this moment is not in a space to contemplate what comp ed looks like. We are struggling with, eviction, joblessness, COVID. housing, whatever's going on, you can say to the school, look, I know he's entitled to comp ed. I don't have the bandwidth right now to figure out what that looks like. Let's have a conversation in 6 weeks. That's okay. All right. Just document the fact that you think he's entitled to it. All right. Again, those recovery services that we were talking about a minute ago, things like high density and tutoring, accelerated instruction, that should occur within the context of the regular school day. All right. So that is separate and apart from comp ed. Comp ed, again, is all about those special education goals. And it should be considered to address what recovery and accelerated instruction does not. Okay. And then Jasmine threw this note in here, and I think this is super important. Comp ed is something that you may be in a weird spot with, because I know a lot of families have changed schools during the course of the pandemic. The LEA that was serving the child during the pandemic is the LEA that is required to come up with a compensatory education plan. Okay, unless they somehow contract with a new LEA or come up with the agreement, it is the old LEA. So let's say you were at charter school A and you moved to charter school B this school year, but you were at charter school A last year. You have to go back to charter school A and talk about comp ed. Okay, charter school B can't deliver that service. Okay, if they're two separate LEAs. Okay, if you're going from DCPS school to DCPS school to DCPS school, or KIPP school to KIPP school to KIPP school, or friendship school to friendship school, you don't need to go back and forth. But if you're going between different LEAs, so like from a charter to a DCPS, or from one charter to another charter, the charter that provides the services during the last school year is the school that needs to be having the conversation about comp ed. Sound good? All right. Whew. All right, additional guidance. So this kind of goes to the question we just had from Kristen. All those discipline requirements and LEA policies remained in effect. Okay, again, trainings with me at the very beginning part of the pandemic were very boring, because I just said the law is the law, the law is still the law, is still the law. Okay, discipline requirements, all that stuff stayed the same. And local educational agencies still had an obligation to identify, locate, and evaluate students who may have a disability. It's called the Child Find obligation. And that obligation kept right on trucking right through the pandemic. All right, eligibility meetings for special education and some evaluations could have happened virtually. But when they couldn't have happened virtually, and maybe the eligibility meeting was delayed, guess what? You needed to have a conversation about comp ed. Okay. Related services still needed to be documented, still needed to be provided. And if they weren't, guess what? Comp ed. All right. And then again, this accelerated learning, because that does seem to be something that a lot of LEAs are interested in as a way of doing kind of general education, COVID recovery. Accelerated learning should be considered in the context of individual IEPs. Okay. So just because the whole school is doing accelerated learning, doesn't mean that a child's individual IEP needs to be tossed out the window, because again, that's not what we do. All right. And then we have a great question in the chat. Can we talk about related services and service trackers where they say over and over the student was not available? Yes, we can talk about that. The law still required that they provided FAPE. So showing up and writing down on a sheet of paper the student is not available is not providing FAPE. What did they do to make the student available? Did they talk to the family about scheduling? Did they reach out and say, when's a good time to meet with this kid? Did they make sure the kid had all the things that they needed? Their obligation to provide FAPE was still their obligation to provide FAPE. And if the student's not available, that means they need to problem solve around that, because the student still had a right to FAPE. So, if there's related services and the service tracker just says student not available, I would really hope there are also communication logs where there are conversations about how do we reach the student. And then if the student continued to be unavailable all year, then I think we might need to have a conversation about compensatory education and what that looks like, and what did the school do to reach the student? Because again, because we're going to go back in time, they were supposed to schedule this stuff with families. They were supposed to do this in collaboration with families. Families should receive regular communication. And if the student wasn't available, perhaps they were homeless, perhaps they didn't have internet, perhaps they were having an emotional crisis, perhaps they were grieving. That doesn't revoke consent for those services, and that doesn't mean the child's not entitled to FAPE. The child is still entitled to FAPE. It is a civil and human right of the child. And the school district's failure to collaborate with the family to serve the child doesn't mean that they're not entitled to comp ed. And honestly, I'm really hoping that the guidance from the federal government, making it so clear that school districts have to talk about comp ed, means that school districts have less reluctance to talk about compensatory education and are less inclined to view compensatory education as some kind of failure on their part. And they can be a little more pragmatic. Can I speak about families who receive non-working devices over and over again? Yes, and I can say that it is analogous to the scenario you just said. If the device doesn't work, it doesn't work. The obligation is to provide a free, appropriate public education. It's not an obligation to try to provide a reason. You have to actually do it. And giving the family a non-working device is not doing it. I mean, that's not providing FAPE. That's denying access. To give a kid a non-working laptop or a hotspot that doesn't work when that's what they need to access FAPE is every bit as a denial of access as it is to ask a student in a wheelchair to magically roll up stairs. It's not significantly different. It's a denial of access. It's just not particularly frustrating to get a non-working device over and over again, but it's the same analysis. One reason why we spent so much time at the beginning of this conversation talking about how the law didn't change is that it's the same analysis when we're talking to schools now. Did you provide access to FAPE? Did you provide FAPE? Well, if the kid got a non-working device over and over again, it's kind of like the schoolhouse doors are locked. The device doesn't work, they can't get in. And that's how I would frame it. Jasmine, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I would totally agree with Maria on that one.
Well, I should have
kids have to be able to have access. It's all the same. It's all the same. If you don't have a computer, then you can't access really anything. So I think that's a hard pill to swallow, or even a tough argument to make that kid was provided FAPE if they don't even have a working computer or hotspot, for example. So then we talk about what's next. So that's really what all of the guidance has said about COVID and recovery planning and what has to happen. So now we're at the point where we're at the beginning of the school year. We're having these conversations. What do they look like? What do you need to know as parents? Next slide, please, Maria. Let me go to the next one.
Preparation is key.
So things to do before your IEP meeting. The first thing is to get organized. You probably need to ask for a complete copy of your child's records from last school year. And this includes assessments, both formal and informal. I just want to highlight that informal part because, again, for a lot of students, they weren't able to get formal assessments for one reason or another. And so just because an assessment was completed informally does not mean that there shouldn't be some kind of records or documents that say what the assessment was and kind of what was the outcome of that. So you want to ask for that. IEP progress reports. This is another thing that came up consistently during our focus group of families saying, they didn't get one. You need to ask for one. Because again, these obligations did not change just because we were at home. Any prior written notices, related service track records, any distance learning plans. I also want to highlight that one because distance learning plans were really created not to change the IEP services, but to talk about how those IEP services should be provided, right? So if, let's say you had a distance learning plan and you had an hour pullout every day in the IEP, and then you got the distance learning plan, and suddenly there was no pullout. That's a problem, and that's a conversation in which you need to be having related to compensatory education. You also want to ask for the school's comprehensive plan to address accelerated learning or other approaches to recovery. Those were due to OSCE, I believe, in like July, right, Maria? Something like that. So you want to know how your school overall is addressing that. You want to prepare discussion points that you like to raise, especially those related to missed services and or ineffective services. And again, ineffective services are services that were provided, but it just didn't help the student. They didn't receive any benefit from it. I'm just reading the chat for a second.
Yeah.
Just checking in case I missed it, but does the distance learning plan need to be identified in the IEP? No, but school should have had a conversation with you if there was a distance learning plan created, because technically it is not an IEP service. It just explains how those IEP services will be provided in a virtual learning environment. Other things you should think about: incorporating some of the guidance provided to you through this training, but also looking at, and I'll show you guys in a second, but we have a live binder full of resources, including the guidance from OSCE, the guidance from OSEP, that you may want to include and incorporate as a part of your conversation around why your child is entitled to any comp ed or related services. You also have a right to receive all documents in advance of the meeting about comp ed at least 5 days, unless you agree to meet in less than 5 days. If you agree to meet in less than 5 days, like say the school reaches out and says, can we meet tomorrow? You say yes. Then they just have to provide those documents to you ASAP. If you have additional questions, we are always here to help you prep before your meeting.
Mm-hmm. And then one of the things we're going to go over is, how to prep for the compensatory education part of this conversation. But we have some great videos and a parent agenda and a parent checklist for preparing for regular IEP meetings. And we're just kind of going to talk a little bit about the tweak of, how do you prepare for the comp ed conversation? But something that Jasmine said that I really just want to highlight, because I'm difficult like that, is if you're having this conversation, right? And you're saying, look, my kid didn't make the expected progress. And the school says, well, we delivered all the services we were supposed to deliver. Okay. I really want folks to remember that the IEP is not like a compliance document. It's not designed to just be a check the box thing. Okay. So if you delivered services that didn't work, or that were ineffective or inaccessible or inappropriate, then you didn't provide FAPE. Okay. And I think that can be a really hard thing to hear sometimes for schools. So there can be a tendency to say, well, I did all the things I was supposed to do. And that goes to that question in the comment, well, I've got the service tracker filled with a bunch of times when they said the student was unavailable. Well, that's not the point of what we're doing here in education, right? We're not trying to show up and provide services to kids who aren't there. We're trying to actually provide services to kids to get them where they need to go. And those services are supposed to be effective, right? So please don't feel like just because, the school has a list of times they talk to your child, or they have a service tracker that says they tried to deliver services, but the student was unavailable, or they delivered services and then, you saw the services and you're like, this isn't working. This is not a productive speech therapy session. That's not the end of the conversation. And I think if you take nothing else from today's conversation, I really want you to remember and think about the fact that This is a substantive conversation about progress towards IEP goals.
Mhm.
It's not a conversation about, did you show up and check the box? Because teachers do a lot more than that. Parents do a lot more than that. Students do a lot more than that. We are a lot more than checking boxes. We are not in the business of checking boxes. We're in the business of educating kids to have, full, meaningful, independent lives. And that's not a conversation about box checking. Does that make sense? Do people feel okay with that? Okay. All right. Okay. So during the IEP meeting, again, some of you guys have seen this before, but get clarification. If you don't understand why the school is saying something, for goodness sake, ask. Bring copies of the regulations and guidance that support your opinions. We'll kind of go through some documents and resources that HAE has to support you with that. Take your own notes or ask to record the meeting. Parents in the District of Columbia do have the right to record meetings. The district is a single party consent state, which means that anybody can record a conversation as long as one party in that conversation consents to it. But I always tell people, for goodness sake, it's very rude to record people without their permission, just like I did in today's training. I told you I was going to record things, gave you notice. Do schools the same courtesy and give them a heads up, tell them. Always request a copy of the meeting notes and make corrections to them, okay, if necessary. Again, request a copy of their meeting notes and make corrections to them if necessary. And always put things in writing, get it in writing. Request any refusal to provide comp ed or any award of comp ed should be in writing. And absolutely, the school has provided copies of the meeting notes. Now they do get a couple days to type it and put it together and get it to you, but they do have to provide copies of meeting notes. Those are an educational record. They don't have to provide, the thing that they don't have to provide are teachers' personal notes that are unrelated really to the meeting, that aren't official meeting notes. But they do have to provide a copy of the meeting notes. But they can take a day or two to clean them up and record them and do everything. Does that make sense? I hope. Okay. Again, get stuff in writing. I had a parent one time tell me they had a great comp ed plan, and nobody else at the meeting knew there was a comp ed plan because the parent perceived an agreement that the child was going to get this service. They perceived that to be compensatory education, and that's not what it was. So please do get it in writing. Everything is in writing all the time. And get a refusal to provide comp ed. If they say, no, we don't think we need to talk about comp ed, get that in writing too. And that can go in the notes, or it can be a prior written notice. Again, you've heard me say this 100 times as relates to comp ed. It should be based on your child's needs and progress towards goals. And please be creative when it comes to comp ed. I'm really worried that we're going to have, kids going to school 8 hours a day, and then every parent in the city is going to think my kid needs 2 hours of tutoring every day. And I don't know about you. I would be very upset if someone made me do 2 additional hours of work after I did 8 hours of work. So just, be creative. Tutoring might not be the best solution for every kid. And remember that it's okay as a parent if you say, hey, look, I know you think this kid made progress. I really don't think he did. I don't think these services were effective. This is why I don't think that. And Jasmine makes a really good point. Remember, they have to explain both inactions and actions. And that's part of that prior written notice. Note any disagreement that you may have, and that's okay to disagree. There's going to be disagreements during this comp ed process. And finally, only sign documents you agree with. You have a right in the district to take the document home and think about it. And the advice that I tell people, and this is why it's not on a slide, although I think one day, Jasmine, I'm going to make a slide about this. You have a right to take the documents home and read them without 7 IEP team members staring at you, with the beverage of your choice. Okay, I used to tell people they should, take that IEP home and drink it with a glass of wine, but tea is also very good. One of my favorite people only reads IEPs with bourbon. But take it home and think about it, because it's a really important document. And your little person is a really important little person, and they deserve your undivided attention and a chance for you to read and think about it without a bunch of people staring at you. And that's perfectly fine. You take it home, take 3 to 5 days and then send it back. Okay. And it can be in conversation. You can take it home and say, oh, I disagree with this, this, and this. Please make these changes. That's fine too. But I think that's really important. And I don't want parents to ever feel pressured to sign an IEP or sign anything. Does that make sense? All right. Okay. After the IEP meeting, after the meeting, all right, first of all, use your social skills. Okay, use your social skills. You've got them for a reason. They do work. Say thank you, do all that stuff, even though free appropriate public education is a civil and legal human right of a child. So, I don't know why on earth we need to say thank you for actualizing people's rights, but we do. So use your social skills and say thank you. If you have a comp ed award or a comp ed plan, make sure you have it in writing and know how you're going to implement it. It should be useful and usable. Okay, compensatory education should be useful and usable. And just in case any of you don't think I say nice things about schools, that is a phrase I stole from a very good DCPS attorney who told me that comp ed should always be useful and usable. And I think that's a really good term. Always remember that you're going to be monitoring implementation of both the IEP, but also, monitor that comp ed. Is the comp ed plan you got the right comp ed plan? Is it working? Is it not working? Is the service provider the right service provider? Is the service the right service? It's supposed to do something. If it's not doing it, you need to come back to the table and have a conversation. Okay. And then don't forget, if you have disagreements that can't be resolved in this context, the entire panoply of dispute resolution options are still available to you. So that's a due process complaints, that's mediation, that's facilitated IEP meetings, that's a state complaint. And, the district is well stocked with resources, and you can always call HAE if you need assistance accessing any of those resources. But there's a lot out there to help you get where you need to go on this. And I don't want you to think that any part of this IEP conversation should be take it or leave it. Okay, you guys still with me? All right, so we're going to do a little bit of Q&A. I'm going to run through some links and we're going to chat a little bit. I want to talk through the links though before we do the Q&A, which I know is not the order that the slides are in. Is that okay? Thumbs up, that's okay? Jasmine, you want to make it if I do that? Okay, all right. So you guys can still see everything, right? Yes, it's working. Okay. So if you are a DCPS parent, okay, and we're going to send all of you the slides. So don't panic. If you don't see this, don't panic. We have some resources that might be really helpful to you. Okay. And this is one of our blog posts that's got some resources that are helpful. And this is what I want you to see here. Okay. First of all, we have a document here listing the locations of all of the self-contained classrooms. Not super useful for today's conversation, but it's handy. So I want you to know it's here. But we also have here these program guides. Okay. And these are the program guides for what these classrooms, for self-contained classrooms, are supposed to be working on. Okay. And then also we have a link here to other DCPS program guides. Okay. And this includes what is supposed to happen, for example, when an evaluation is late, the steps a provider is supposed to take if a child is unavailable. And again, this is only for DCPS. And then here's my favorite one, the missed related services and untimely assessment guidelines. This is a document that DCPS was supposed to post online, that they did not post online, that we obtained via FOIA, that they have still declined to post online. But it's a real document, it's valid. And it tells you what DCPS's own policy says that schools are supposed to do when they miss services. Okay. All right. Okay. It's really useful. And I actually sometimes recommend that non-DCPS people look at it just to get a sense of what's a reasonable thing. Okay. But it's particularly useful for DCPS families. Okay. And this has got, again, for speech language, school psychology, school mental health, audiology, occupational therapy. Okay. Okay. So that was one resource I wanted people to know. Again, just because I am like this, I always like to remind people that this is where the restraint and seclusion policy can be found. DCPS, for reasons unclear to me, has failed over the course of the last 10 years to publish their restraint and seclusion policy. So I always like to remind folks, we try to post it periodically on our website, but I do want people to know that this is the policy. If you have a student in DCPS who has ever been restrained or secluded at school. Okay, just because I think that's a super important thing for people to know about. Oh, you guys can see these, right? Okay, good. All right. I had a horrified moment. I was like, oh, I don't see the green box. So I was afraid you couldn't see me anymore. All right. The other link I want to look at are some resources to help families prepare for IEP meetings. This has a video in it with our colleague, Stacey Une, and she uses something called the parent agenda to help families prepare for IEP meetings. It is very handy and useful. I am not an agenda person. I'm more of a checklist person, but you can download your own copy of it here. And it's a Word doc, so you can personalize it and do whatever you want to with it, but it's very nice. It's a parent agenda, and it's very useful for comp ed meetings as well. Okay. And then we also have here a link to yet another video about what school's obligations are during distance learning. So if you get bored or can't sleep one night, or miss Maria saying the law has not changed, even though there's COVID, the law has not changed, even though there's COVID, I here have an entire video where I now say this for 20 minutes in various forms and iterations that you're welcome to view. And we also have this very handy short pre-meeting meditation. And I only want to highlight that because I think sometimes we forget as parents and as advocates that IEP meetings are emotionally demanding. Okay, let's be really honest and blunt. IEP meetings are at their core conversations about your hopes and dreams for one of the people you love most in the world. That's intense. Often the IEP meeting starts with a list of what children can't do. They are very emotionally demanding things. So I always like to remind folks that self-care is an important part of having a good IEP meeting, and self-care can happen before and after the meeting. So a little pre-meeting meditation can be great. And then a little post-meeting cup of hot cocoa can also be good, or whatever it is you need in the beverage department. Okay. So we have a nice little link here about having a good meeting that I really like. And then finally, we have this live binder and the password is right here. And in the live binder, Carissa, our amazing program associate, has given me the wrong access key. So now she's not such an amazing program associate, but we'll try again. 5678. Yes. Okay, you can keep your job, Carissa. All right. Here is all of this great stuff. Okay. And we're going to start at the top and just run through it really quickly. No thanks. And we're not going to click on all these because you're going to get this link. But the thing I really want you to see is guiding principles for continuous education. Very helpful, very handy. Summer programming by incoming grades. This was from DCPS. Links to our website. And this was the COVID certification for distance learning. There's a lot of good stuff in here. Okay. Okay. And the one thing I do want you to see is we have a compensatory education conversation checklist that's really designed to help you frame this conversation. It's based on, for those of you who've seen it, the checklist we use for parent trainings, for parent preparation for IEP meetings. So this is really comp ed specific. It doesn't go over all the things you need to prepare for an IEP meeting. So if you're going to use this, do it in conjunction with whatever else you do to prepare for your IEP meetings. Okay. All right. As always, our website is a continually updated, amazing source of information and resources. And I like to remind folks that it is searchable. So if you are stressed and you don't know what else to do, and you're just like, I don't really know what I'm doing next, I'm worried, just searching the website can often get you something helpful. Searching IEP, you see our trainings, resources, what you need to know about meetings, preparing for an IEP meeting. So, any other keyword is important. Freedom of Information Act, lots of stuff. Okay. Sound good? All right. Okay. So here's what we're going to do. Okay. Oh, and yes, I have lots of information on special education lawyers. We have a referral sheet that we can email out. And then if you're not in the DC area, we always recommend COPA is a great place to find folks. But I always like to remind folks that generally speaking, IEPs were supposed to, in theory, be designed to be navigated by folks who don't have an attorney. It's not always reality and it's not always how it works. But in theory, you should not need an attorney for this process. But that's, very often true in theory, not in practice. But we have a referral sheet for the district. And then don't forget, if you're not in DC, there's a PTI in every state in the jurisdiction, and COPA has a great referral sheet too. But I can attach the referral sheet to the chat for DC. And I'm going to ask you guys to do me a favor. This is our evaluation. Please, please, please. I will put this link in the chat, and hopefully you nice, kind, loving folks will complete this while you are formulating your questions for the Q&A. Does that sound like a plan? Okay, because I'm going to turn off the recording so we can have a little bit more of a candid conversation. And sound good? You guys will do the evaluation? Sound good? All right, I'm going to copy it out of the chat because that seems to work better than copying it off of this thing. And this is who we are and where we are. And by the way, if you're not following us on social media, please do that. We try very hard to put some good stuff out there. Okay. Okay, so going to stop recording. I'm going to copy this link. Oh, no, I don't want to select everything. Shoop. And I'm going to pop this in the chat. And you guys are going to meditate on your questions while you do the evaluation. Is that fair? All right. Yes. Mm-hmm. Oh, we can do our questions in the chat, or you can take yourself off mute. Whatever.
Just 1 second, Maria, before you start that. Don't forget to stop the recording.
I did stop the recording. I did, I think. No, I didn't. Thank you.